The old ambassador made one final statement before returning to his seat. He said that when the humans were wronged, they would come for justice and they would not stop coming until they received it. Distance would not deter them, time would not discourage them, and superior force would not frighten them. They would adapt, they would learn, and they would keep pursuing until they achieved their goal or died trying. He asked the council to remember his words when that day came. The session moved on to other business, and within an hour, most delegates had forgotten about Velric's strange warning. The humans were a minor curiosity and nothing more. The galaxy continued as it always had, with strong species dominating weak ones, and the council maintaining a comfortable fiction of order and law. 3 days later, a crawl raiding fleet approached the human colony world designated New Bethlehem. The colony was young, only 15 years established, with a population of just over 23,000. It had no military defenses beyond a few orbital sensors and a small security force with light weapons. The Crawl had raided hundreds of such colonies from dozens of species, and this one appeared no different. Commander Zethus personally led the raid because he wanted to send a message to these upstart humans, who were gaining too much attention from naive council members like Velric. The attack lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, 15,000 humans were dead and another 8,000 were loaded into slave ships. The Crawl took everything of value from the colony and destroyed the rest. They left behind burned buildings and bodies as they had done countless times before on countless other worlds. As his fleet jumped into hyperspace carrying their captives and loot, Zethus felt satisfied. The humans would file a protest with the council, perhaps impose some trade sanctions, and eventually accept their loss as the price of living in a dangerous galaxy. That was how these things always went. The strong took from the weak, and the weak complained to authorities who did nothing. What Zethus did not know, what none of the Crawl knew, was that they had just made the worst mistake in their empire's long history. They had hurt the humans and taken their people, and now something had awakened that would not rest until every wrong was answered. The hunt was about to begin, and it would not end until the last human captive was free or the last human hunter was dead. The galaxy was about to learn what Velric had tried to warn them about, and the lesson would be written in fire across the stars. 3 months had passed since the fires of New Bethlehem had cooled, and the human pursuit had become the single most discussed topic in every corner of the known galaxy. On space stations and trading posts, in diplomatic corridors and military academies, beings from 1,000 different worlds talked about the relentless chase that showed no signs of ending. The humans had followed the Crawl across 17 different star systems and fought battles in places that most species considered too dangerous or too remote to bother with. They had engaged enemy forces in dense asteroid fields where collision was a constant threat, inside nebulas where sensors barely functioned, and even near the radiation-soaked edge of a collapsing star system that most navigators avoided completely. Ambassador Velric sat alone in his private chambers on the Torvan homeworld, reviewing the latest intelligence reports about the ongoing conflict. The walls of his study were lined with data crystals containing the accumulated knowledge of his long life, and the window showed the golden sunset of his world's twin suns. He had lived for over 4,000 cycles and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But something about this human campaign fascinated him in ways he had not expected. His warning to the council had been ignored, as he knew it would be, but watching his predictions come true gave him no satisfaction, only a deep sense of concern for what it meant for galactic stability. A priority message appeared on his communication console, and he recognized the seal of Council Speaker Thrain, requesting his immediate presence at an emergency session. Velric allowed himself a moment of grim amusement, because he knew exactly what the session would be about. The comfortable order of galactic politics was being disrupted by a species that refused to follow the established rules, and the elder races did not know how to respond. The council chamber was more crowded than Velric had seen it in centuries. Representatives from species that normally sent junior diplomats to routine sessions had come in person, and the gallery seats reserved for observers were filled with beings from worlds that did not even hold council membership. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next in the drama that had captivated the entire galaxy. The air hummed with dozens of translation devices working overtime to keep up with the multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Speaker Thrain's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated stress and concern. The Nexus worlds were one of the oldest and most influential members of the Council, and Thrain, had held the speaker position for over 200 cycles. He was accustomed to maintaining order and managing conflicts through careful diplomacy, but the human situation had spiraled beyond his control. He called the session to order, and the chamber fell silent as he began outlining the current crisis. The humans had now violated the territorial space of 4 different sovereign nations while pursuing Krull forces. 3 of those nations had filed formal protests demanding that the Council intervene to stop what they called an illegal military campaign. The 4th nation, a smaller power called the Viridian Collective, had actually offered the humans permission to operate in their space after learning that the Krull had raided their own colonies in the past. This had caused a diplomatic incident, as other nations accused the Viridians of undermining Council authority. Representative Kiris of the merchant guilds asked what response the humans had given to the protests and demands to cease operations. Thrain's form flickered with frustrated colors as he explained that the human diplomatic corps had responded with polite but firm statements. They acknowledged the territorial violations and offered to pay compensation for any property damage, but absolutely refused to stop their pursuit of the Krull slavers. The humans claimed they were engaged in a lawful rescue operation in the pursuit of war criminals. Therefore, no amount of diplomatic pressure would make them abandon their people. Velric rose from his seat and requested permission to speak. Thrain granted it with a gesture that suggested he knew the old Torvin would say something the Council did not want to hear. Velric reminded the Assembly that he had warned them about exactly this situation 3 months ago. The humans did not calculate military operations the way other species did, and they would not stop their campaign simply because it was diplomatically inconvenient or tactically difficult. Persistence was coded into their very nature, and trying to reason them out of it was like asking water to flow uphill. Commander Zethus appeared via hologram transmission from his flagship, somewhere in deep space. The proud Krull warrior looked diminished and exhausted in ways that shocked many of the Council members who knew him. His scales had lost their shine, and his posture showed none of the arrogant confidence that had defined him for decades. He spoke with barely controlled rage about the human pursuit and how it violated every principle of civilized warfare. Zethus explained that his forces had been trying to lose the human fleet for 3 months, using every evasion technique the Krull had perfected over thousands of years of raiding. They had split their fleet into smaller groups, used decoy ships to draw pursuers off course, hidden in sensor dead zones, and even sacrificed several vessels as distractions. Nothing worked because the humans simply adapted to every tactic and kept coming. When the Krull divided their forces, the humans divided theirs. When the Krull used decoys, the humans learned to identify them and ignore them. When the Krull hid, the humans searched until they found them. The Krull commander demanded that the Council intervene and force the humans to accept a negotiated settlement. His empire had already lost over 30 warships to the relentless pursuit, and the constant fighting was bleeding resources that should have been used to defend Krull territory. Other species that the Krull had dominated for centuries were starting to resist now that they saw the mighty empire being harassed across the galaxy. Rebellions had broken out on 3 Krull subject worlds, and pirate groups that normally avoided Krull space were becoming bolder. Velric asked Zethus a simple question that silenced the chamber. Why not simply return the human captives and end the conflict? The Krull had taken 8,000 humans and still held most of them in various locations across their empire. Returning them would cost the Krull nothing but pride, while continuing the fight was costing them ships, resources, and reputation. The logical choice seemed obvious to everyone except apparently the Krull themselves. Zethus responded with the outrage of a warrior whose honor had been questioned. The Krull Empire did not surrender to inferior species, and they did not negotiate from positions of weakness. Returning the captives would send a message to the entire galaxy that the Krull could be intimidated by a sustained campaign. Every species they had ever raided would expect the same treatment, and the Empire's power would collapse. Better to fight the humans to mutual destruction than show such weakness. The chamber erupted in voices as various representatives argued over the correct response. Some supported Zethus and called for council sanctions against human military aggression. Others pointed out that the Krull had started the conflict by raiding a civilian colony, something they had been doing for centuries with no consequences. A few suggested that maybe the humans were teaching everyone a valuable lesson about the cost of attacking defenseless populations. Thrain called for order and the voices gradually quieted. The speaker acknowledged that the situation was unprecedented, and the Council had no clear authority to intervene in what was technically a bilateral conflict. However, the disruption to galactic commerce and the violation of sovereign territories could not continue indefinitely. He proposed sending a mediation team to negotiate a settlement between the humans and the Kraul that would return the captives, and establish new protocols for dealing with colonial raids. Before anyone could respond, a new message appeared on the central display. It was a public broadcast from the human government addressed to all members of the Galactic Council. The message was brief and direct. Humanity thanked the Council for its concern but politely declined any mediation efforts. The pursuit would continue until every human captive was recovered, after which humanity would be happy to discuss diplomatic solutions. The message ended with a simple statement that sent chills through many of the assembled representatives. The humans were prepared to pursue this matter for years or even decades if necessary, because that was how long it would take. The explosion lit up the nebula like a new star, and the Kraul cruiser broke apart from the impact. Zethus watched this happen and felt something he had not experienced in decades of warfare: uncertainty. His tactical officer was making confused sounds and asking why the human ship had not retreated. Why would a commander sacrifice his vessel and crew when they could escape? Zethus had no answer because in Kraul military doctrine, a damaged ship always withdrew to fight another day. Throwing away ships and lives for no tactical gain was not warfare, it was madness. But the humans were not being tactical. They were being emotional and angry and absolutely determined. They had come for their people and they would either get them back or die trying. There was no middle ground and no surrender and no retreat. The Kraul had never fought an enemy like this because most species valued their own lives more than their objectives. The battle lasted 6 hours and by the end the Kraul base was shattered. Morrison's fleet had lost 4 ships completely destroyed, and every surviving vessel had damage. But they had won and they had found captives. 400 humans were recovered from the base's holding cells, frightened and hurt, but alive. Morrison stood in the relentless cargo bay and watched medical teams treat the rescued colonists, and felt his first moment of satisfaction since this whole nightmare began. 400 recovered meant 7,600 still in Kraul hands somewhere in the galaxy. Morrison looked at his exhausted crew and his damaged ship and knew they were all thinking the same thing. This was just the beginning and they had a long way to go. The Kraul could run, but they could not hide forever because the humans were coming, and they would never stop coming until every single captive was free. 6 months had passed since the flames consumed New Bethlehem and turned a peaceful farming colony into a graveyard of broken dreams. The human pursuit had taken them across half the known galaxy, through regions of space that appeared on star charts with warnings about navigational hazards and hostile forces. What had begun as a rescue mission had transformed into something far more significant, something that was changing the fundamental rules of how species interacted in the galactic community. Every race that had ever been victimized by stronger powers watched the human campaign with fascination and growing hope that maybe the old ways did not have to be the only ways. Admiral Henry Cole now commanded the overall operation from his flagship, the UNS Vindication, a heavy cruiser that had been pulled out of reserve status and retrofitted with the best weapons and sensors humanity could provide. Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted to fleet commander and given operational control of what had grown into a massive undertaking. The Retribution fleet now numbered over 300 vessels of various types and sizes, from military destroyers to armed cargo ships whose civilian captains had volunteered for combat duty. The fleet had become a symbol of human determination that inspired some species and terrified others. In his ready room aboard the Vindication, Morrison met with his senior staff to review the latest intelligence reports and plan their next moves. The walls displayed star maps with hundreds of markers showing confirmed Kraul positions, suspected hiding locations, and areas where human captives might be held. Commander Lisa Grant stood at the central table and activated a holographic display that showed the current tactical situation across multiple sectors. She reported that the Kraul Empire was fragmenting under the sustained pressure of the human campaign. After the devastating losses at the Void Expanse and dozens of smaller engagements, the centralized command structure that had held the Empire together for thousands of years was breaking down. Individual fleet commanders were making their own decisions about where to run and how to hide, and some were even attempting to negotiate separate peace deals with the humans in exchange for protection. From their own leadership, Morrison asked about the location of the remaining captives, and Lieutenant Amy Chen brought up a new display, showing the galaxy with numerous red dots scattered across a vast area. She explained that tracking had become significantly more difficult as the Kraul dispersed the human prisoners to prevent exactly what the humans were doing. Intelligence suggested the captives were now spread across at least 40 different locations, ranging from hidden prison facilities on remote worlds to labor camps on established Kraul colonies to slave ships that constantly moved between systems. Lieutenant Paul Hayes shook his head and stated what everyone in the room was thinking. The Kraul had scattered the captives across a third of the galaxy, and recovering them all would take years of sustained effort. His voice carried a note of frustration because he understood the mathematics of the situation, and the odds seemed insurmountable, even for humans who specialized in attempting the impossible. Morrison looked at his officer with an expression that had become familiar to everyone who served under him. It was a look of absolute determination that never wavered no matter how bad the tactical situation became. He said simply that if it took years, then they would spend years, and if it took decades, then they would spend decades. The timeline did not matter because they were not going to stop until every single human captive was home. The mission would end when it ended and not one moment before. Lisa Grant studied Morrison carefully and noticed things that worried her as his friend, even though she respected him as her commander. He had aged visibly in the past 6 months, with new lines on his face and gray appearing in his hair that had not been there before. They had all aged in various ways because the constant fighting and endless pursuit took a toll that went beyond physical injuries. But something in Morrison's eyes remained unbreakable, a core of determination that sustained him when logic and reason suggested they should accept partial victory and negotiate for the crash. She mentioned that the Galactic Council had once again proposed mediation and that the Kraul leadership was now willing to discuss returning the captives in exchange for the humans ceasing all military operations. Several council members had privately suggested that the humans had already accomplished more than anyone thought possible, and that accepting a negotiated settlement would be the wise choice. Morrison listened to this information without changing expression, and then asked what the next target was. Amy Chen highlighted a location on the star map and reported that intelligence had identified a Kraul prison facility on a planet called Talgor 3. The information suggested approximately 200 human captives were being held there in a heavily fortified compound that also housed prisoners from a dozen other species. The facility was deep inside territory controlled by a Kraul warlord who had declared independence from the Central Empire and was now operating as essentially a pirate king. Morrison studied the tactical data and noted that the facility had significant defenses, including orbital weapons platforms and a garrison of experienced soldiers. He asked Lisa to prepare an assault plan and ordered the fleet to move into position. When she hesitated and mentioned that the cost in human lives might be high for 200 captives, Morrison met her eyes with a look that reminded her why she followed him. He said that every single one of those 200 people had families waiting for them and that each one mattered as much as the thousands they had already rescued. Word of the human campaign had spread to every corner of civilized space and beyond, into regions where galactic law barely reached. Species that had suffered under Kraul aggression for generations watched with amazement as the newcomer humans refused to accept the natural order of strong dominating weak. On worlds that had lost colonies to raiders, on stations where slaves were traded openly despite council prohibitions, and in communities that had learned to fear the powerful, people began to wonder if resistance was possible. Group of Viridian colonists who had lost an entire settlement to Kraul raiders 15 cycles ago gathered in their community center to watch news broadcasts about the human pursuit. They had filed protests and appeals and spent their savings on ransom payments, but ultimately accepted that most of their people were simply gone forever. That was how things worked in the galaxy, and everyone knew that fighting back against superior force was suicide. Now they watched humans who seemed to have missed that lesson completely and were succeeding through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. One elderly Viridian whose daughter had been taken in the raid spoke about how they had begged the council for help and been told that military intervention would destabilize the region, They had pleaded with the Krall to return the captives for ransom and been laughed at by beings who saw them as weak and exploitable. Eventually, they held memorial services and tried to move on with their lives because what else could they do against an empire that had thousands of warships and controlled dozens of systems? A younger Viridian asked what made the humans different and why they succeeded where others failed. The elder explained that it was not about military strength or advanced technology, because the humans had neither advantage when they started. It was about the simple fact that humans apparently did not understand the concept of accepting defeat. Every other species in the galaxy had learned when to cut losses and move on, but humans seemed to lack that particular survival instinct. They just kept coming no matter how many times they were knocked down. Another community member pointed out that the human approach was economically insane and strategically foolish. They had spent more resources on the pursuit than the entire colony of New Bethlehem was worth in pure economic terms. They had made enemies of neutral powers and exhausted their military to the point where their home systems were vulnerable. Any rational species would have accepted partial victory and negotiated for favorable terms rather than pursuing total recovery at such enormous cost. The elder smiled sadly and said that maybe being rational was not always the best choice. Maybe sometimes the irrational decision to never give up and never abandon your people was worth more than all the rational calculations of cost versus benefit. The humans were teaching the galaxy a lesson that had been forgotten in the comfortable millennia of council rule. Some things mattered more than money or tactical advantage or political stability. Some things were worth fighting for even when victory seemed impossible. Back aboard the Vindication, Lieutenant Paul Hayes sat in the observation deck looking out at the stars and thinking about his sister, Karen. She had been visiting New Bethlehem on business when the Krall attacked and was among those taken in the initial raid. For 6 months he had continued his duties while not knowing if she was alive or dead, suffering in some alien prison or already sold to new masters in a system beyond reach. The uncertainty was its own special torture, but he endured it because Morrison had made a promise that Paul believed with his entire being. Across the galaxy, the impact of the human campaign was being felt in unexpected ways. On a remote trading station called Nick's Outpost, a group of merchants from various species gathered in a cantina to discuss business and share news. The topic inevitably turned to the humans and their seemingly insane pursuit of the Krall slavers. A young Viridian trader mentioned that he had heard the humans lost a frigate and 19 crew members while chasing a single Krall transport that only carried 10 human prisoners. He asked what kind of species traded 19 lives for 10. An older merchant, a Torven freighter captain with scars from decades of dangerous routes, set down his drink and looked at the young trader with an expression of sadness. He explained that it was not about the numbers or the tactical mathematics of loss versus gain. It was about the message that such actions sent to everyone watching. The message said that humans would come for their people no matter how long it took, no matter how much it cost, and no matter how impossible the odds seemed. That message had power beyond any weapon. The old merchant shared his own story. 40 cycles ago, the Krall had raided his brother's colony and enslaved everyone they did not kill. His family had filed protests with the council, paid ransoms for who they could afford to buy back, and eventually accepted that the others were simply lost forever. That was the way things worked in the galaxy, and everyone understood it. The strong took from the weak, and the weak learned to accept their losses and move on. But the humans rejected that entire system and were teaching everyone that acceptance was a choice, not an inevitability. Other merchants at the table fell silent as they considered this. Some of them had lost family members or friends to various raiders over the years. All of them had simply accepted it as the price of living in a dangerous galaxy where the council maintained the illusion of order, but rarely enforced it. Now they watched as newcomer species refused to accept that reality and fought back with a determination that bordered on madness. A Draxian energy, being that had been listening to the conversation, made a sound like crackling electricity. It pointed out that the human approach was irrational and economically unsustainable. They had mobilized 40% of their total military strength for a rescue operation that would bankrupt most governments. They were making enemies of neutral powers whose space they violated, and they were spending resources on a campaign that had no clear endpoint. How was this anything other than self-destructive behavior? The old Torven merchant smiled and explained that maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe the humans were willing to be irrational and economically foolish and self-destructive because they valued something more than profit or political advantage. They valued the principle that their people mattered and would not be abandoned no matter what it cost. Such thinking made no sense to species that calculated everything in terms of resources and advantages, but it made perfect sense to anyone who had ever wished someone would come for them when they were lost. Back in the council chamber, Velric prepared to leave after the session ended with no clear resolution. Thrain had appointed a committee to study the situation and recommend actions, which everyone knew meant the council was hoping the problem would resolve itself. As Velric walked through the corridor toward his transport, a young aide from the Viridian delegation approached him. The aide asked quietly if Velric truly believed the humans would pursue the Crawl for years as they claimed. Velric looked at the young being with ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. He told the aide that he did not believe it, he knew it with absolute certainty. The humans had made a promise to themselves and to their captured people, and they would keep that promise or die trying. The galaxy was about to learn a lesson that had been forgotten over millennia of comfortable civilization. Some things were worth fighting for regardless of cost, and some species would never stop fighting once they started. The humans were teaching that lesson, and the Crawl were learning it the hard way. Morrison found him there and sat down without being invited, because they had served together long enough that formality seemed unnecessary. Paul asked if they would really keep searching for years if that was what it took, and Morrison answered without hesitation. He said they would keep going until every human was accounted for, because that was the promise humanity had made to itself. The galaxy could think they were crazy or irrational or doomed to fail, but none of that mattered compared to bringing their people home. Paul mentioned that some of the other species were calling humans the endless pursuers, and that Crawl mothers apparently used the threat of human vengeance to frighten their children into good behavior. Morrison allowed himself a brief smile at that, and commented that maybe fear was a useful tool for teaching bullies not to pick fights. The Crawl had raided weaker species for thousands of years, because there were never real consequences beyond diplomatic protests and economic sanctions that meant nothing to a military empire. Now there were consequences, and the lesson was being taught in a way that no one would forget. Amy Chen found both of them in the observation deck and reported that the assault on Talgor 3 was ready to begin. Morrison stood and headed toward the bridge with his officers following. As they walked through the corridors, crew members stopped what they were doing to watch their commander pass. Some saluted, others simply nodded with respect, but all of them shared the same expression of determination that had become the defining characteristic of the Retribution fleet. The assault on Talgor 3 lasted 18 hours and cost the human fleet 2 destroyers and over 100 casualties. But when the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, 207 human captives walked free from the prison compound. Morrison stood in the landing bay and watched medical teams treat the rescued prisoners, many of whom were malnourished and injured but alive. One of them was Paul Hayes' sister Karen, and the reunion between siblings made even the most hardened veterans turn away to hide their emotions. The count stood at 6,400 recovered captives, which meant 1,600 still remained in Crawl hands, somewhere in the vast galaxy. Morrison looked at the numbers and felt no satisfaction in how far they had come, because the only number that mattered was getting to 0. The fleet would rest for 3 days to repair damage and treat wounded. Then they would continue the hunt. The Crawl could scatter the remaining captives across 1,000 worlds, but it would not save them because the humans were coming, and time was not a limitation, but simply another obstacle to overcome. 1 full year had passed since the Crawl raiders descended on New Bethlehem and turned a thriving colony into ash and memories. 365 days of relentless pursuit across the galaxy, through battles that would be studied in military academies for generations, and past obstacles that would have stopped any other species a dozen times over. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the main cargo bay of the UNS Vindication and watched as the final group of rescued captives came aboard, their faces showing a mixture of relief and disbelief that someone had actually come for them after all this time. 438 humans filed through the airlock, the last survivors from a hidden facility that the Crawl had maintained in a system so remote that it appeared on few star charts. They were thin and scarred, and some could barely walk after months of forced labor, but they were alive and they were free. Medical teams moved among them, providing immediate care. while other crew members distributed blankets and food and water. Morrison counted each face as they passed because after 12 months of hunting, he had memorized the names and images of every single person taken from New Bethlehem. The number was complete now, and the impossible task was finished. 8,000 humans had been taken, and 8,000 humans were now accounted for. Some had been rescued in the first weeks of the campaign, while others had been recovered just hours ago from that final hidden prison. 41 major battles had been fought, and countless smaller skirmishes had occurred across 17 different sectors of space. The human fleet had lost 53 ships completely destroyed, and another 100 damaged badly enough to require months of repair work. Over 2,000 crew members had died in the pursuit, and thousands more carried injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The cargo bay erupted in sounds of celebration as crew members who had served the entire year realized their mission was truly over. People embraced, and some wept openly, while others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Morrison allowed himself a moment to close his eyes and feel the weight that had pressed on his shoulders for 12 months finally lift. Every single person who had been taken was now back in human hands, and the promise had been kept. Commander, Lisa Grant approached Morrison with a communication tablet and informed him that Admiral Henry Cole was requesting their presence via secure channel. The Galactic Council had sent an urgent summons demanding that human military leadership appear before them to answer for what the Council called numerous violations of galactic law and diplomatic protocol. Morrison took the tablet and read the formal language with its lists of complaints and accusations, then handed it back to Lisa with a slight smile. He told her to inform the Admiral that they would be happy to attend the Council session. The Council chamber looked exactly as it had 1 year ago when Ambassador Velric delivered his warning that nobody wanted to hear. The same crystalline walls reflected starlight from the windows, and the same circular rows of seats held representatives from hundreds of worlds. But the atmosphere was completely different now because everyone present understood that the balance of galactic power had shifted in ways that could not be easily reversed. The humans had proven something that many species had forgotten was possible, and that knowledge changed everything. Speaker Thrane's crystalline form pulsed with colors that seemed less confident than before as he called the session to order. Admiral Cole and Captain Morrison entered the chamber flanked by an honor guard of human Marines in dress uniforms. The humans walked with the bearing of people who had fought for a year and won every battle that mattered, and their presence commanded attention in ways that mere diplomatic credentials never could. Thrane began with the official statement charging the humans with multiple violations of sovereign territory, breaches of diplomatic immunity, destruction of neutral property, and general disregard for the established laws that governed interactions between spacefaring species. The list of charges took several minutes to read in full, and the translator system struggled to keep up with the formal legal language. When Thrane finished, he asked if the human representatives had anything to say in their defense before the Council deliberated on appropriate sanctions. Morrison stepped forward before Admiral Cole could speak, and his voice carried clearly through the vast chamber. He acknowledged that human forces had indeed violated territorial boundaries and engaged in military operations in neutral space. He confirmed that diplomatic protocols had been bypassed and that several instances of property damage had occurred during the pursuit. Then he stated clearly that humanity would do it all again, without hesitation if their people were ever threatened in the same way, because no law or protocol or diplomatic convenience mattered more than the lives of their citizens. The chamber filled with sounds of shock and outrage from several delegations who had expected at least a token apology or attempt to justify the actions through legal arguments. Morrison continued speaking over the noise and pointed out that the Krall had raided civilian colonies for thousands of years, while the Council issued statements and formed committees and accomplished nothing of substance. The laws that the Council wanted to punish humans for breaking were the same laws that had allowed the strong to prey on the weak, with minimal consequences. Commander, Zethus appeared via hologram looking even more diminished than he had at the previous emergency session 6 months earlier. His scales were dull, and his military decorations seemed to hang awkwardly on his reduced frame. The proud warrior who had commanded the raid on New Bethlehem was gone, and in his place stood a broken leader whose empire had crumbled around him during the year-long human campaign. He tried to demand reparations for destroyed Krall military assets, but his Voice lacked conviction and several council members made dismissive sounds. Morrison turned to face the Crawl commander's hologram and spoke with a coldness that made even experienced diplomats shift uncomfortably. He told Zethus that the Crawl Empire could demand whatever it wanted, but humanity had a different proposal. The humans had compiled detailed records of 47 other colonies that the Crawl had raided in the past decade, along with documentation of hundreds of similar attacks going back centuries. Humanity was prepared to continue their diplomatic outreach to the Crawl unless the Empire wanted to discuss reparations for all those victims as well. The hologram flickered and went silent as Zethus apparently realized he had no leverage left and nothing to gain from further confrontation. The Crawl Empire that had dominated the sector for 3,000 years was now fragmenting into competing warlord territories as subject species rebelled, and former allies distanced themselves from association with failure. The mighty military that had crushed countless opponents had been broken not by superior force, but by an enemy that simply refused to stop fighting. Ambassador, Velric rose from his seat and requested permission to speak. Thrain granted it with a gesture that suggested the old Torvin was one of the few voices the speaker still trusted. Velric reminded the council that he had warned them 1 year ago about the nature of human determination and persistence. Everything that had happened since then had simply confirmed what he tried to tell them. The question now was not whether to punish the humans, but how to adapt to the new reality they had created. Representative Quiris of the Merchant Guild supported Velric's assessment and added that the human campaign had already produced measurable effects across the galaxy. Piracy rates had dropped by 40% in regions where raiders previously operated with impunity. Species that had been regular targets of stronger powers were reporting that aggressive neighbors were now hesitant to launch attacks. The humans had reminded everyone that actions carried consequences and that some victims would pursue justice regardless of cost or difficulty. Thrain was silent for a long moment while colors shifted across his crystalline body in patterns that suggested intense internal debate. Finally, he spoke and acknowledged that the council could not officially approve what the humans had done because it violated too many established precedents. However, he stated that no formal sanctions would be imposed given the exceptional circumstances of the case. The council would instead focus on establishing new protocols for dealing with colonial raids and civilian attacks to prevent similar situations in the future. Admiral Cole stepped forward and thanked the council for their understanding, but made it clear that humanity's position had not changed. Humans had not come to the galaxy seeking conflict or trying to disrupt the established order. They wanted only peaceful trade and friendly relations with other species. But if anyone attacked human civilians or took human prisoners, the response would be the same as it had been for New Bethlehem. The pursuit would be relentless, and it would not end until every single human was recovered or every human ship was destroyed trying. The bridge of the UNS Relentless hummed with quiet activity as Captain Jake Morrison stared at the holographic display showing what remained of New Bethlehem. The images had been transmitted by an automated probe that survived the attack, and what it showed made his blood run cold. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets scorched by plasma fire, and bodies that nobody had been alive to bury. The colony had been home to 23,000 people, and now most of them were gone. 15,000 confirmed dead and another 8,000 simply vanished, taken by the Crawl raiders who had swept through the system like a plague. Morrison had been in the military for 18 years and seen combat on 3 different worlds, but nothing had prepared him for this. These were not soldiers who died in battle, but civilians, who had been growing crops and raising families and building a new world, far from Earth. Children had lived in those burned buildings, and families had walked those scorched streets, and now they were either dead or worse, enslaved by creatures who saw humans as nothing more than property to be traded. Lieutenant Amy Chen worked her sensor console with steady hands, despite the tears running down her face. Her cousin had lived on New Bethlehem with his wife and 2 daughters, and she did not yet know if they were among the dead or the taken. She looked up at Morrison and reported that the tracking analysis was complete. The Crawl fleet had jumped to hyperspace 72 hours ago on a heading toward the Outer Rim territories, where they maintained several hidden bases. Morrison asked how long since the attack, and Amy confirmed it had been exactly 72 hours. 3 full days had passed while the human government debated responses, and the council issued statements calling for restraint, and the Kral slavers ran deeper into space with their human cargo. 72 hours was a long time in space warfare, and most commanders would consider a pursuit hopeless after such a delay. Most commanders were not human. The captain turned to his helm officer and ordered a pursuit course at maximum sustainable speed. The young ensign at the helm station looked up with surprise because everyone knew that a 3-day head start in space was nearly impossible to overcome. Morrison repeated his order with a tone that left no room for question, and the helmsman began plotting the course immediately. Commander Lisa, Grant stepped closer to Morrison and spoke quietly so the rest of the bridge crew would not hear. She was his first officer and his friend, and she felt obligated to point out the tactical reality. The Kral had a massive head start, and by the time the Relentless reached the outer rim, the raiders could be anywhere in dozens of different star systems. They could split up, hide in asteroid fields, or simply keep jumping until they reached Kral home territory, where human ships would not dare follow. Morrison listened to her concerns, and then told her they would search every system if they had to. They would check every asteroid field and follow every lead, and they would not stop until they found those ships and brought the captives home. Lisa started to mention that the Galactic Council had already issued a statement calling for diplomatic solutions and peaceful negotiations, but Morrison cut her off before she could finish. He told her the Council could issue whatever statements they wanted from the safety of their floating chamber far from any real danger. They could debate and negotiate and write strongly worded letters while human families mourned their dead and prayed for their captured loved ones. The Relentless was not going to send diplomatic notes or wait for council mediators to arrange talks. They were going to find the Kral slavers and either make them surrender the captives or destroy them completely. Lisa understood, and so did every other member of the crew. Within an hour, word had spread through human military channels about the Relentless and its mission. Morrison had not asked for volunteers or requested a fleet, but they came anyway. Captains throughout human space heard what happened at New Bethlehem, and they made their own decisions. Some were active military vessels and others were reserve ships called back to service. And a few were armed merchant vessels whose captains simply decided they were going hunting. Within 1 week, 17 human ships had joined the pursuit. They ranged from destroyers and frigates to converted cargo haulers with missile pods welded to their hulls. The crews started calling themselves the Retribution Fleet, though the official designation was Task Force Perseverance. None of them cared what name appeared on military documents because they all knew why they were really there. Humans had been taken and humans were going to get them back. The Kral had been raiding colonies for thousands of years, and they were good at disappearing after their attacks. They used false transponder codes and avoided major shipping lanes and generally vanished into the vastness of space where pursuit was nearly impossible. But they had never been hunted by humans before, and they did not understand what that meant. They left a trail because they did not think anyone would be crazy enough to follow it. Lieutenant Amy Chen worked her console day and night, tracking down every scrap of information she could find. A fuel depot reported selling reactor mass to ships matching the Kral profile. A sensor station on the edge of a nebula had picked up hyperspace signatures consistent with heavy cruisers. A merchant captain remembered seeing unusual ships at a remote trading post. Each piece of information was small and meaningless by itself, but together they formed a path that the humans followed with relentless precision. 12 days into the hunt, they caught up with a Kral supply ship at a neutral trading station orbiting a gas giant. The station master tried to invoke diplomatic immunity and declare the station off-limits to military action, but Morrison ignored him completely. The Relentless moved into firing position and Morrison opened a channel to the Kral vessel. His message was simple and direct. Surrender the human captives and face trial or be destroyed where you sit. The Kral captain responded exactly as Morrison expected. The alien's translator rendered his words into contemptuous laughter, followed by weapons fire. The supply ship's guns were no match for a human destroyer, but the Kral captain was not trying to win a fight. He was buying time for his hyperspace drive to charge, and the moment it was ready, his ship vanished into faster-than-light travel. Most pursuing ships would have lost the trail at that point because hyperspace wakes dissipated quickly, and without knowing the exact destination. Finding a ship after it jumped was nearly impossible. But the Relentless had been ready for this, and Amy Chen had her sensors locked onto the crawl ship's hyperspace signature. The human destroyer jumped less than 10 seconds after the supply ship and emerged from hyperspace close enough to still have sensor contact. Amy reported they had tracked the crawl ship to a heading toward the Calros. Nebula and Morrison ordered the pursuit to continue. The supply ship was running scared now, and scared people made mistakes. The crawl captain was heading for what he thought was safety, but he was actually leading the humans directly to his base. Other species might have broken off the pursuit when they realized they were being led into a trap, but humans saw it as an opportunity. The Calros Nebula was a massive cloud of ionized gas and debris that played havoc with sensors and communications. The Kral had hidden a forward operating base deep inside it, where they processed captives and stored loot from their raids. It was supposed to be impossible to find and impossible to attack, even if someone knew where it was. The nebula's interference meant ships could not target accurately at long range, and the dense gas clouds provided perfect cover for ambush tactics. Commander Zethus himself was at the base when the human fleet arrived. He had been overseeing the processing of the New Bethlehem captives and felt smug satisfaction at how well the raid had gone. Then his sensors picked up human warships emerging from hyperspace at the nebula's edge, and he could not believe what he was seeing. No species had ever tracked the crawl to this base, and certainly no one had ever been foolish enough to attack it. Zethus watched his tactical displays as the human ships entered the nebula without hesitation. They should have been cautious, should have sent scouts ahead, should have probed for defenses. Instead, they came straight in like they did not care about the tactical disadvantage or the risk of ambush. The Kral base had over 40 ships stationed there, including several heavy cruisers, and Zethus was confident his forces would tear the humans apart. The battle started badly for the humans, and got worse. Kral ships emerged from the gas clouds, firing at point-blank range where the humans could not maneuver. 2 human frigates were destroyed in the first 5 minutes, and a destroyer took critical damage to its engines. Morrison watched his tactical display fill with red warning indicators and listened to damage reports flood the communication channels. Any sane commander would order a retreat to regroup and develop a better strategy. Morrison ordered all ships to advance and press the attack harder. The human fleet pushed deeper into the nebula, taking damage but refusing to break off. One destroyer, called the Determination, had its main reactor knocked offline and lost power to all primary systems. The ship was crippled and helpless, and everyone expected it to withdraw using emergency thrusters. Instead, the captain used what little maneuvering power he had left to ram a Kral cruiser at full speed. The massive hall of the Galactic Council stood silent as Ambassador Velric walked toward the center platform. His tall figure moved with the grace of someone who had lived for thousands of years. The Torvan species was one of the oldest in the galaxy, and everyone knew that when a Torvan spoke, it was wise to listen. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, floating in space above a dead moon, with transparent walls that showed the stars beyond. Representatives from hundreds of worlds sat in circular rows, their forms varying from crystalline beings that glowed with inner light to massive creatures that breathed methane and floated in specialized tanks. The air carried the hum of countless translation devices working to convert speech into forms each species could understand. Velric reached the speaking platform and raised his primary hands in the traditional gesture of important news. The chamber grew quieter, and even the younger delegates who usually whispered among themselves fell silent. He had requested this emergency session 3 days ago, and speculation had been running wild about what the old Torvan wanted to discuss. Some thought it was about trade disputes in the Outer Rim, and others believed he would propose new mining regulations. No one expected what came next. The humans had arrived in galactic space only 3 standard cycles ago. They came in primitive fusion drive ships that barely qualified as faster-than-light capable, and their first contact had been almost comical as they tried to navigate diplomatic protocols they did not understand. The Council had granted them provisional membership, as was standard for new species, and most representatives had promptly forgotten about them. After all, new species joined every few decades, and most never became significant players in galactic politics. The humans seemed destined for the same obscurity with their small fleet and single colonized system beyond their homeworld. Velric began to speak, and his voice carried through the translation network. He told the Council that he had spent the last 3 cycles studying humanity in detail. His research teams had downloaded and analyzed their entire digital history, their literature, their military records, and their cultural practices. What he found disturbed him deeply. The humans possessed a trait that made them fundamentally different from every other species in the known galaxy. They did not understand the concept of giving up. The other delegates shifted in their seats with confusion and mild amusement rippling through the crowd. Velric continued without acknowledging the reaction. He explained that human history was filled with examples of pursuit that defied logic. They had hunted large animals by simply following them for days across vast distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. This was called persistence hunting, and it was how their ancestors survived before they developed advanced weapons. Even after they created guns and other tools, the behavior remained embedded in their culture. He brought up examples on the holographic display that floated above the platform. There was the story of a human law enforcement officer who tracked a criminal for 11 years across multiple countries before finally capturing him. There was a war between two human nations that lasted 30 years over a strip of land neither side truly needed. There were families who spent generations searching for lost relatives. There were scientists who devoted entire lifetimes to solving single problems and explorers who died trying to reach places simply because they were difficult to reach. Speaker Thrain of the Nexus Worlds interrupted with a sound like glass chiming. His crystalline body reflected the starlight from the windows as he rose to his full height of nearly 4 meters. He thanked Velric for the interesting cultural presentation, but questioned its relevance to council business. The humans were primitives who would take centuries to catch up to galactic standard technology, and their persistence was surely just a quirk of their evolutionary history that would fade as they matured as a species. Other delegates voiced agreement, and several made sounds that their translators converted to laughter. The Draxian representative, a being of pure energy contained in a magnetic field, suggested that Velric was perhaps too old and seeing threats where none existed. This drew more amusement from the younger delegates, and even some of the elder species representatives seemed to think Velric was overreacting. But Velric pressed on with his warning. He explained that the danger was not in human military strength or technological advancement, but in their absolute refusal to accept defeat. He had found records of human soldiers in ancient wars who continued fighting, even after losing limbs, and others who escaped prisoner camps dozens of times, despite knowing they would be punished. There were accounts of humans crossing oceans in tiny boats simply to reach new lands, and stories of parents who spent every resource they had to find missing children, even when authorities told them the search was hopeless. The Torvan ambassador activated another hologram, showing human sayings and phrases collected from their databases. Phrases like, "Never give up" and "Persistence pays off" and "We will never surrender" appeared in dozens of human languages. He pointed to one phrase in particular that appeared in their military culture. "No one left behind," he explained. That this was not just a motto but an actual practice, where human soldiers would risk entire units to recover a single fallen comrade. Commander Zethus of the Kral Empire had been listening, with growing irritation. The Kral were warriors who had conquered hundreds of systems over the past 2,000 cycles, and they did not appreciate lectures about combat from prey species. Zethus rose from his seat, his scaled body covered in armor that reflected his numerous military victories. His species had perfected the art of raiding and conquest long before most council members had discovered fire. They took what they wanted from weaker species, and the council had never seriously challenged them because the Kral were simply too powerful. Zethus spoke with contempt dripping from his words. He stated that if the humans ever dared to challenge the Kral Empire, they would be crushed like all the others who had tried. One Kral battlecruiser carried more firepower than the entire human fleet combined, and his empire had thousands of such ships. The thought of being threatened by a species that still used chemical rockets just a few generations ago was laughable. The chamber erupted in sounds of agreement from several militant species, who saw Velric's warning as an insult to their own power. How could persistence matter against overwhelming force, and what good was determination against weapons that could destroy planets from orbit? The humans had no special technology, no psychic powers, no ancient artifacts that gave them an edge. They were just another carbon-based species with opposable thumbs and delusions of importance. Velric's antennae drooped in a gesture of sadness that only other Torvans would recognize. He had delivered his warning as honor demanded, but he could see it would not be heeded. The Council had grown comfortable in their power and forgotten that the galaxy had once been a more dangerous place. They had forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous predator was not the strongest or the fastest, but the one that simply refused to stop hunting. Morrison added that the galaxy had just learned a very old human lesson that went back to their earliest history. He said that predators should think carefully before attacking prey that might chase them forever, because persistence often defeated power in the long run. The humans were teaching everyone that strength came in many forms and that determination was a weapon as dangerous as any gun or bomb. The Krall had learned this lesson at tremendous cost, and hopefully, others would be wise enough to learn from their example. 3 months after the council session, Morrison stood in a lecture hall at the Human Military Academy on Mars, addressing new recruits who had enlisted after the New Bethlehem campaign ended. He had retired from active service and returned to Earth, but agreed to occasionally teach classes about interstellar diplomacy and military strategy. The young men and women in the seats before him represented the next generation of human spacers who would carry forward the lessons learned during that year of pursuit. A recruit raised her hand and asked what happened to the Krall Empire after everything ended. Morrison explained that the Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a unified power and was now a collection of independent warlord territories constantly fighting each other. Colonies that the Krall had dominated for generations declared independence, and other species that had been victimized for centuries were demanding justice. Once someone finally stood up to the bullies and won, everyone else found the courage to resist as well. Another recruit asked about Commander Zethus and what became of the leader who ordered the attack on New Bethlehem. Morrison said that the last intelligence reports showed Zethus living in exile on a minor world with no power and no followers. His name had become a cautionary tale in what remained of Krall military culture, used to teach young warriors about the dangers of underestimating opponents. The phrase "do not awaken the humans" was now common in Krall space and used to discourage aggressive actions against species that might respond with sustained campaigns. The recruit who had asked about Zethus followed up by asking what Morrison planned to do in retirement after spending a year in constant combat. The former captain smiled and explained that he had moved to New Bethlehem to help manage the memorial for those who died in the attack. The colony was being rebuilt by survivors and families of the victims who wanted to prove that the Krall had failed to destroy the human spirit. Morrison said he was done with fighting, but if humanity ever needed him again, he would answer the call because that was simply who humans were as a species. Back in the Galactic Council chambers, Ambassador Velric prepared his final report on what he called the human question, before retiring after 4,000 cycles of diplomatic service. He wrote that the humans had forced every species in the galaxy to confront uncomfortable truths about how they had maintained peace through acceptance of injustice. For millennia, the Council had preserved stability by allowing certain levels of predation and abuse because confronting every wrong seemed too costly and too difficult. Velric concluded his report by noting that humans accepted no such compromise and operated on principles that seemed irrational to species who calculated everything in terms of cost and benefit. They would chase you forever across any distance and through any obstacle, not because they were uniquely powerful, but because they were uniquely unwilling to quit. The galaxy had adapted to this new reality whether it wanted to or not, because the humans had changed the rules simply by refusing to accept the old ones. On Earth and across every human colony, the story of New Bethlehem became part of the cultural heritage passed down to each new generation. Children learned the names of those who fell during the pursuit and studied the battles that brought 8,000 people home. They learned that humanity had made a promise to itself and kept it through determination and sacrifice. The phrase "no one left behind" took on new meaning as a principle that defined how humans interacted with the wider galaxy. And across that galaxy, in 1,000 different languages and among countless species, a new understanding emerged that changed the calculations of power and aggression. The humans would chase you forever if you harmed their people, and no distance was too far and no time was too long and no cost was too high to stop them. It was no longer a warning that could be ignored, but a fact that everyone accepted. The galaxy had entered a new era, and the humans had written the first chapter in their own unique way.